Hi everybody, and thanks for joining us to Innovator Island Day 1, building a serverless web app for a theme park. My name is James Bezic. I'm a senior developer advocate here at AWS Serverless. I'm a self-confessed serverless geek, so I've been building serverless applications for a couple of years now. Before this, I was a software developer for a long time, and then a product manager for many years as well. So I previously worked for multiple different startups, as well as bigger companies like USAA and Rackspace. I enjoy travel, coffee, and comedy, but most importantly, theme parks, which is why we're all here today. Now, in this page, you'll see my email and my Twitter account as well. So during today and during the workshops, or even after, if you have questions about the workshop or serverless, don't hesitate to reach out and send me a message. I'll be happy to help. So the goal of these 5 days is for you to learn how to use a range of different AWS services to build a real-time web application. All of the code that is provided for you, so you don't need to actually write any code at all to complete the challenges. You just need to follow the instructions in the GitHub repo. This is a 5-hour virtual workshop that happens over 5 days. So we're doing 1 hour per day. And this is a live event. This is not pre-recorded, so everything you're hearing is happening right now. So if you have any questions at all, we have a range of different DAs on staff ready to answer your questions. There's a great opportunity to answer any of your questions about serverless or the workshop in general. Now, each of one of the workshops is consecutive and builds on the last. So if you miss an episode, don't worry. The episodes correspond to modules in the GitHub repo, so you can catch up if needed. But hopefully you can make every episode. Now, all of the slides and replays and resources related to this will be sent to everybody who's registered here today. Now, on the left side of the screen, you'll see a Q&A pod. So please submit any of your questions for our presenters and moderators at this time, and we'll address them as they come in. At the conclusion of today's presentation, there'll be several poll questions during the Q&A, so please provide us with your feedback when you see these poll questions to help us make the workshop better for next time. So the workshop is designed to cover a wide range of different serverless services, and our goal is to help you see how these work in a real app so you can see how they might work in your own apps in your own businesses. I'm going to walk through the workshop steps, step by step, and do the exercises along with you. So the idea is that you'll be following along with the instructions at the same time as I'm doing them as well. Now, as we progress through the workshop, there'll be various points where I pause for deployments to happen and other things to go on. And I'll stop regularly to dive deeper into each topic and also to answer questions that you raise periodically. Now, the full agenda for the whole 5 days is in the bit.ly link posted on the screen here, bit.ly/island workshop. We'll post that link also in the Q&A, so you can click it from there. So there are a few prerequisites for today. You firstly need an AWS account. If you don't have one, go to aws.amazon.com to sign up. You can do that fairly quickly if you don't have one. Preferably, you really want to use your personal account with full admin access because the workshop uses lots of different services, and it's easier than using your corporate account. From a cost point of view, this workshop is completely free, but running the steps may incur charges in your account. Now, for most people, it should be doable within the free tier. Most of the services we're using shouldn't incur you any cost, but just be aware that it's possible to get charged if you leave services running or you use them beyond the dev and the test this week. So to take part in today's activities, you'll need a laptop or a desktop computer, not a tablet. If you have a tablet, this won't really work for you, so it'd be better to watch along in a recorded session once you have a desktop or a laptop available. Please use the Chrome or Firefox browser for optimal compatibility. We found that using Cloud9, you get best compatibility with both of those browsers. Now, we will be building a range of different integrations with services like Lambda, API Gateway, DynamoDB, to name but a few. So existing familiarity with the AWS Management Console is helpful, but is not essential. Remember, our goal this week is to help you complete the workshop. So anytime you get stuck or you have questions, please give us your questions in the Q&A. So each of the services will be used in the workshop this week. We're split into developer tools and backend services. So there's 3 key developer tools we'll be using. First is AWS Amplify Console. This helps us eliminate any manual steps in publishing front ends, helps us automate the publishing pipeline and create a CI/CD pipeline. It's also very easy to use, so you'll get to see that in action. Code commit is a Git-compatible repo that we'll be using to store our code. You don't have to use it for AWS Amplify, but we're using this in this workshop to keep things simple. And we'll also be coding using the Cloud9 IDE, which I'll talk about more in the moment, but it allows us to do everything in a browser and keeps things very easy for our Q&A and moderators to follow along with where you are in the workshop. Now, on the back end, there'll be several other services. There's 9 different services that we're using in this workshop. The first is Lambda. This is the compute on demand service that many people think of as being the whole of serverless, but really it's just one of the services in a whole range of different serverless services that are available. So serverless includes other things such as API gateway. So Innovate Island is a front-end application and a back-end application. And API gateway is the front door to the back-end. We also use S3. This is a highly durable object storage available. In this app, we use it for storing binaries such as user photos. And then there's QuickSight. This is a business intelligence tool. And you'll see later in the week how you can use it to see how the park is performing. We start to collect information from visitors to the park, and we analyze what their behavior is like using QuickSight. Now, EventBridge is a newer serverless service that you may have heard of. It's a serverless event bus. This allows us to easily decouple parts of the backend to keep our services simple. And it makes it really easy for us to add new functionality down the road as the application grows. Then there's DynamoDB. This is a low-latency, high-throughput, NoSQL database. It's the database behind the Innovator Island application. Then there's SQS. This is a flexible, low-latency messaging service. It makes it very easy to pass messages between different services, but also send emails or SMS text messages, so you'll be able to get your hands on with that service too. Now, many modern web applications need real-time integration. This is the ability to update automatically when the data or state changes. You see this in applications like email clients, that when email arrives, you don't refresh the page. The front end automatically knows about this. In this workshop, we use IoT Core to achieve this, and we'll be discussing how this works in detail tomorrow. And then finally in the list, we have Kinesis Data Firehose. So in the theme park, our park guests wear wristbands that tell us which rides that they're visiting. So Kinesis lets us ingest this large amount of data and process it for tools like QuickSight. So although this is quite a few services, we'll cover each of these in more detail as they come out throughout the workshop. So let's talk about AWS Cloud9. This is a fully featured cloud-based IDE that runs inside of a browser. Now, the workshop has been tested with Cloud9, and it helps us avoid any issues with local laptop builds or local configurations. So please use this instead of your local IDE as you go through the instructions. It also has a built-in terminal and temp space as well, and it has provisioned bandwidth within the AWS network. So you don't need to use your own Wi-Fi when you're pulling down these packages. You can simply use the bandwidth within Cloud9. So that all being said, welcome to Innovator Island. I'll give you a little bit of background on how this was started. So this was originally built for the AWS reInvent in 2019. We had 3 workshops in total with about 500 people. Now, since then, the workshop has expanded to include other modules for other events like Serverless Days Nashville. Now, since reInvent, we've had about 1,000 people who've gone through the workshop in total. And it's also used internally too. We have systems architects and account managers who also get training internally with AWS using exactly this workshop that you're taking part in today. And this workshop is designed to showcase how to build a single-page application-style app with a serverless backend for large numbers of users. So in this scenario, the theme park is opening at the end of this week. And the park expects to have 50,000 visitors. The app provides navigation to these 50,000 visitors, so there's no printed maps or anything like that. They'll be using this app to find their way around the park, learn about rides that have wait times, and also take photos on the rides during their stay. So this is this week's adventure we have over the next 5 days. So today we will be building and deploying the front-end and back-end applications. Now the code and the application has already been built, so all we'll be doing is deploying those services. And once you get to the end of the day, you'll be able to access your deployed application from your desktop browser or your smartphone. So to do this, we're going to use AWS Amplify Console to connect the front-end code repo. This implements CI/CD processes automatically, which means any time that we commit a change to the repo, it automatically republishes the front end. You'll also deploy many of the backend services that you'll need for the following modules as well. We're using the Serverless Application Model, that's SAM, to deploy these resources. Sam the squirrel is also the park's mascot, so you may see him around the park. SAM templates make very light work of deploying serverless infrastructure, and you'll find out more about this in Module 1. All of this will be done using the Cloud9 IDE. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing to do is to go to this URL in your browser. Go to bit.ly/Innovator Island. We'll post this link in the Q&A, so I'm going to move off this deck now and open up my browser and start stepping through the instructions. So if you go to bit.ly Innovator Island, it takes you to this GitHub repo where today we'll be just finishing step 0, the setup, and step 1, the app deploy. So let's start at step 1, or step 0, the initial setup. So the first part of this is to make sure that you have an AWS account. And so you can sign up from this link if you don't currently have one. I hope you have one. If you do have one, please log in now. We'll be starting to use the services within your account. So in my second tab up here, I'm logged into my AWS account. Now you also need to make sure that you select a region where the workshop is supported. So currently, this is supported in 5 different regions. I'm selecting the US East 1 region because that's the one closest to me, but you should pick the one that is closest to where you're located. So just make sure it's one of these 5 locations. To change the location, just go to the AWS Management Console, and in the top right, you'll see a region drop-down showing the list of regions. So I'm in North Virginia, that's US East 1. So the first part of this is to get the Cloud9 IDE up and running. So if we go to the step-by-step instructions in this section, first we want to go to the services dropdown and find Cloud9 IDE in the developer tools. So I go to services and I'll search for Cloud9. And we found the console for Cloud9 there. So in the next steps, we're going to click Create Environment and then enter the name of theme park development. So I'll take a copy of that there. So I click Create Environment and paste the name in there. Great. Now we're going to click Next Step and go through and leave the defaults that have been set up and finally hit Create Environment in step 6. So back here, I hit Next Step. These defaults will stay the same. Now, if you are doing development on large-scale applications, you can choose larger instances for Cloud9. Right now in this workshop, we don't need anything beyond the T2 micro, and that's included in the free tier allowance. But we leave those defaults as set. And note down here that if you close the window at all, this instance will go into standby after 30 minutes. So leave that checked as well. And then click on Next Step. Okay, then we can review those settings we've put in and just click on Create Environment. Now back in the instructions, that takes us to the end of step 6 here. And once your ID is ready, it will open to a welcome screen. Currently, it takes a couple of minutes to deploy, so I'll wait for this to deploy before continuing and see if anybody has any questions. So while this is starting, I'll just review where we've gotten to, because I know some people were starting up their AWS account. So once you've logged into your AWS account, go to the Cloud9 services list and select Create Cloud9 Environment. So let me just bring this up so you can see this. Under Environments, just click on Create Environment. We're currently following the steps in the setup section, the initial setup of the GitHub repo. And we're currently at starting step 7. Okay, so my Cloud9 environment has now been created. So I'm going to close down this README file that starts up. What I'll also do is I'll make the font slightly bigger so you can see the fonts that I'm using. Okay, so now hopefully that's now readable to everybody. Okay, so once your Cloud9 IDE has started, you'll see a similar sort of screen where this is ready. Depending on the environment you're in, you might have a dark or a light background. You can change that in the themes list in the drop-down just here. Okay, so we're in step 7. So let's run a few commands in the Cloud9 IDE so you get a sense of how this works. Firstly, let's run this first command, get caller identity. I'll copy this and go into the terminal just here. That tells me the identity of the person who is running this Cloud9 instance. This is similar to the who am I command in Linux. What we're going to do first of all is start downloading the code that we need to use to be able to build out the workshop. So first of all, let's cd into the environment directory. You should already be there, but this just makes sure that we're all starting in the same place. Next, we're going to git clone the Innovate Island workshop. This is the same repo that you're looking at these instructions in, and we're putting it in a theme park backend directory. Okay, so that's now git cloned all of those different files. If you open up the theme park backend area, you'll see a directory tree with all of these different files that have been now downloaded to the Cloud9 IDE. So at this point, your screen should look very similar to this point in the instructions. Okay, so I'll go back now to the instructions. This showed the file navigation on the left-hand side after cloning the directory. And you can see that here on the left-hand side in our list of files available. And the last thing to do in the setup here is to install JQ. This just helps formatting JSON in the terminal to make it easier to read. So we'll just run this command here. I'll paste that in. And that just takes a couple of seconds to download and deploy. Now, Cloud9 itself is running on top of an EC2 instance. So anything you can do with EC2, you can more or less do with Cloud9. So if you need certain software packages installed, it's very easy to run sudo yum update to pull them into your Cloud9 instance. Okay, so that is the end of this setup. I'm going to wait for a few minutes just to make sure that everybody is in roughly the same place. As it says in the tips, it's a good idea to make sure that you have a notepad type application available because we'll be taking down different variable names just that we need to be able to move between different windows. So open up Notepad or VI or your favorite text editor just so you can save those. So what we've done in this brief setup is we've set up an AWS account, or you've logged into your AWS account. We've opened up a Cloud9 IDE using that service within the console, and we've cloned the initial piece of code that we need to be able to start deploying into Cloud9 IDE. So you'll see all that code there, and we've also installed JQ. So I'll hold right here just to let everybody catch up for a couple of minutes, and then we'll start on with the deployment of the back end and the front end. I just want to add to one of the questions I see here about when you get an error creating an environment. This can happen if you have a brand new AWS account and you've not created an EC2 instance before. So let me just show you one thing you can do to get around that. From the console, if you go to EC2, just here, what you can do, if you launch a new instance as a micro instance, I'll just open this up. You can pick any one of these volumes, select the Linux AMI. leave the default checked T2 micro and just go review and launch instance. What this does is it basically triggers your ability to use EC2 instances within the console. Then when you go back to Cloud9, you'll be able to open Cloud9 without any issues. Another question I have here is about whether the code repo, does it integrate with GitHub? Code commit is a Git compatible repo. It's not connected to GitHub, but if you know how to use Git in either system, it's very similar. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'm going to go to the next part of this where we start processing the app itself. So if you go to the first module, deploying the app. So this is module 1 within the code repo that you got to with the bit.ly link. So the key parts of this are that there's a front-end component and a back-end component to the application. The front-end component is a progressive web app written in Vue.js. Now, the reason why we like using single-page applications for building these kind of applications is that it enables you to compile down the application to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Once you have those assets, you can then put them into an S3 bucket and then serve them globally. Now, instead of us manually copying these assets over to an S3 bucket, we're going to use AWS Amplify Console to automate this process. So although we're using Vue.js in this application, whether you're using React or Angular, it's a similar process for each of these types of frameworks. Now, the backend itself is fairly straightforward as well. It has a DynamoDB table, and it has a Lambda function interacting with that table, and it uses API gateway to interact with the Lambda function. We'll be building this out in the next section, and you'll get to see a diagram of how that works. So first of all, what we're going to do for the front end is create a code repo and code commit. We're going to download all the code we need for that to work, and then we'll deploy it into Amplify Console. So as this diagram shows, when your users start to go to your endpoint to load the front end, they'll actually be hitting the assets that have been deployed by AWS Amplify Console. So to get started, go to the step-by-step instructions in this section. So first of all, we go to the Management Console, click the Services drop-down, and find Code Commit. So I'll go to the console here and open Code Commit. Okay, so we're now logged into Code Commit. Now back in the instructions, what we want to do is hit Create Repository and give it the name Theme Park Frontend. So I'll just copy this, and I'll go back here, click on Create Repository, and paste in that name. You could provide a description if you choose to, but you don't have to. And then click on Create. Okay, when that's finished, it should be almost immediate. You get a green banner at the top that shows you a success that repo has now been created. So we scroll down, and as shown here, you see the success banner. So in the second step of this, we want to clone the code base we've already built the front end for you, so you want to be able to clone that code base and pull all the files you need into Cloud9. So this is what we're going to do. First of all, we're going to use the credential helper to allow Cloud9 to sign into Git on our behalf. It just makes things a bit easier. So if you cut and paste these two lines from the second step, and you paste those into your Cloud9 terminal, just clear here, that sets up the credential helper for you. You don't get any feedback from those commands. It just comes back to a regular command prompt. Now in step 3, what we're going to do is create a new directory for the theme park front end and then pull in the zip file containing all that code. So I'll do this one line at a time. First of all, I'll create that directory. And you can see that theme park front end has now appeared in the file explorer on the left. I'll then cd into the front end. And I'll run the final command, the wget, and this will basically pull down the zip file from this location. When that's finished, you'll see the zip file appearing in our File Explorer on the left there. Okay, so now with the zip file downloaded, we're just going to unzip that file using a simple unzip command on step 4. So that's inflated a whole bunch of files we see just within that directory there. And as the instructions show, you should be able to open up that directory in your Cloud9 instance and be able to see the same files. So once you have these files now on your Cloud9 instance, the next step is to push that to your code commit repo, and then we can connect it to Amplify. So the first thing to do is cd into the front-end directory. Now, I'm already in that directory, but by doing that, I'm just making sure that we're all starting in the same place. Next, I'm going to create an environment variable called AWS region. This is just to make it easy for us to reference the region that we're in. So I run this command, and if I echo AWS region, you'll see now that it shows US East 1 in my case. It'll show a different region depending on where you are. The benefit of doing this is we can use these environment variables throughout the workshop later to avoid having to type things in manually. So then the final instruction here is to run git push, and this sets the upstream to that repo that we created in code commit. So I'll paste that command there. And it's using the credential helper to log into that Git repo. Okay, and that's done. Now if I go back to code commit at this point and I refresh the screen, what you'll see now is that the repo we created earlier has all of these different files. And these are the files that came from that front-end zip file. Great, so that completes the second section. So I'll just pause for a couple of minutes, let everybody catch up to this point, and see if we have any questions. So one question here, do environment variables persist when you close the Cloud9 environment? They don't unless you set them up to do so. It's just like a regular EC2 or Linux instance. A lot of these variables will disappear when you restart the instance. So you can configure it to work that way, but by default it doesn't. So you'll notice in subsequent days in the workshop, we do actually recreate those variables. Somebody asked, what is the cd command on step 5? Let me just review that. I'm saying it looks fairly complex. Yeah. So the cd command actually is just changing into the local environment directory within the Cloud9 and then switching to the theme park front-end directory. Now this second command is really just a bit of magic we've put together to be able to help you find the AWS region. And it's querying the local instance using this URL that's available from all EC2 instances to find out what the region of the instance is. This isn't something you would have to do in your own environment if you didn't want to. Okay, so I'll continue on to the third section. Now we've got the files, deploying the site with Amplify Console. So the first thing to do is to launch Amplify Console, which you can click this link to do, or you can find it in the Management Console in the Services dropdown. So once you open the console, you'll see it looks like the screenshot in the instructions. And we want to click on the Get Started button that's underneath the Deploy banner. So I'll click that there. Amplify Console works with a number of existing repo providers such as GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, or CodeCommit, so you can choose any one you like. Today we're using CodeCommit because it's just easier from the point of view of setting up the workshop. You can also deploy without using a Git provider at all if you prefer. So on step 3, click under the Get Started with Amplify Console, select CodeCommit, and then click on Continue. Now, this will automatically discover any of the repos that we've created so far. So when you click on the recently updated repos drop-down, you'll see the theme park front end, and the only branch available is master. So make sure you select both of those, and then click Next. Okay, we go back to the instructions. Now on the Configure Build Settings page, we're going to leave the defaults, don't need to do anything there, just click on Next. And on the final review page, we'll review these settings and then click on Save and Deploy. So this page, we don't need to do anything other than click on Next. Now on this page, we just need to press Save and Deploy. And this causes Amplify Console at this point to go and connect to our repo, look at what the code is there, and start deploying that build. Now this actually is smart enough to realize the framework we have is Vue. You'll see that in the app settings. So it also runs the Vue build process that otherwise you would be doing manually. Once this starts building, it starts a pipeline where there's 4 different steps to the build process, and you'll see that on the next screen. I'll wait here just a couple of minutes. Let me just see what this issue is. I'll click on Save and Deploy again. I'll just see if we have any questions. So one of the questions I see is, Amplify is not in my region. Yes, if you find, please launch the workshop from one of the 5 regions supported. If you want to see the region list, back in the instructions up here, in the setup piece, in 0 just here, you'll see there's a region selection in this part here. So please select one of these regions where all the services available that you need to complete the workshop. I'll just go back to where we were here. Okay, so we're having an issue with Amplify Console here, so I'm going to have a look at what is happening just there. Okay, so it looks like now Amplify is working. So if you get that error, just click through save and continue and try again. It looks like a temporary error occurred. So in this continuous pipeline, what happens is that Amplify in the background is using a Docker container to provision your application. So it copies all the code from the Git repo, runs a build script, and then starts assembling everything it needs for the Vue.js application. What it then does is it creates an S3 bucket where it puts all your resources, and then CloudFormation template, CloudFront distribution, which points to that S3 bucket. So these are all steps you would do manually to deploy applications yourself if you were serving through S3 and CloudFront, but you can do it completely automatically using Amplify Console. So we'll be using this several times during the workshop, and each time we make a change to the underlying repo, it will automatically discover that and automatically start the build process for those steps. Now this pipeline, you can see where it is on the screen at any point in time. Right now it's provisioned, and it's continuing with this build process that's happening now. The next step will be the deployment, and then finally it verifies the build to make sure everything is okay. At that final step, what happens is that this URL just here becomes a publicly served URL of your application.
phone should I call? James or Wendy?
So we're just waiting at this point for Amplify Console to finish deploying. Okay, so that deployment is now ready. So if I go back to the instructions, just here you'll see that once you have the 4 check marks available, we can then open the published URL in the browser. So let's go back to Amplify Console, and I'll click on this link here, and it opens in a new tab. Now if I press F12 on my browser, it opens the console window, where then I can see what it will look like. It looks more approximated for a mobile desktop or a mobile device. So at the moment, the park only shows us the map. We can zoom in and out of the park map, but it doesn't show us any additional details because the front end's not been connected to the back end at all. So although we've now successfully connected or deployed the front end, the next step is to connect this to the back end. So in step 4, you can now click that link like I just did and go through looking at what your deployed Amplify Console app looks like in your web browser. So your URL looks something like this. It begins with master dot a long code dot amplify app. You can also take this URL and run it on your phone so you can see what the application would look like from a smartphone. So once you've seen that, let's continue with the back-end part of this. So on the back-end, just for now, we have a list of rides that we need to be able to connect to the front end. And we're storing that list of rides using DynamoDB. We create an API gateway endpoint that will then use a Lambda function to fetch the list of rides from DynamoDB. So to set this up, let's get down to the section that says step-by-step instructions. So you need to make sure your Cloud9 instance is still running. And we're going to create a deployment bucket for SAM. So in step 2, these 3 instructions here, the first one, we're going to fetch the account ID from the instance itself. So I'll just clear all of this. If I paste that, now if I echo account ID, you'll see that it's picked up the account ID that I'm using to deploy this application. Then we'll create another environment variable for the deployment bucket. Now, S3 names have to be globally unique across all AWS customers. So the reason why we do it this way is that by appending your account ID to the end, it helps us make sure that we've got a globally unique ID for you. So I create that environment variable. And then finally, if I echo out this environment variable, you'll see this is the name of the bucket that we want to create. Now for step 3, we're going to create the bucket. So I'll copy this command here. This is using the AWS CLI to create the bucket. So just by running that, it's going to use the deployment bucket environment variable and then confirm that that bucket has now been created. So what we need to do now is actually run the SAM deployment templates to start building out the backend. So first of all, in step 4, we're going to change directory to the ride controller application. So that CDs into that directory. And then there's 2 commands to complete a SAM deployment. The first is SAM package. That takes the template and creates a packaged version of it and uploads it to our S3 bucket. This is a fairly small application, so this will happen very quickly. And that's just been uploaded. And then finally, we can deploy what we've just packaged using the SAM deploy command. Great, so this will take just a couple of minutes to finish the deployment. While that happens, I'm going to show you what a SAM template actually looks like. So if we look at what's in that directory, the app deploy directory, ride controller, and also local app, a typical template looks like this. So SAM template is nothing more than YAML. It's nothing too complicated. But the most important thing about it is it defines resources used by our application. So just here, you'll see that there's a DynamoDB table where we specify some of the properties we want to create. Or a bit further down, there's a Lambda function. And in the YAML, it specifies where the code can be found and what the runtime is. So all of these things are things you could do from the console directly if you wanted to. But as you start to build serverless applications, it becomes much, much easier to automate the build of these back-end resources by templating them. Now, the first time we run a SAM template like this, it takes a little bit of time because it's never been run before. So it has to build all the different resources. But when we start to deploy version 2 and version 3, CloudFormation is smart enough to not have to tear down all the resources. It simply deploys the differences. So we'll give this a couple of minutes just to finish deploying, and then I'll look at any questions we have and continue from there. So I'm seeing on some of the questions that several people are having errors from Amplify, getting the error that I saw earlier on the screen. If that's happening, please just hold there for a while and retry in a few minutes, see if the error goes away, or you could try a little bit later. This recording will be available, so if you have to stop because of that, I'm very sorry there's that problem, but you will be able to catch up later if needed. Also, so one question here, what IDE is the instructor using? So I'm using Cloud9 IDE. You can launch that from the management console. So from your AWS console, just go to the services dropdown and look for Cloud9. And from there, you just hit create environment, and that's how you create your Cloud9 IDE. And it looks like this. So one of the questions is, how do we access this tutorial later? So the GitHub repo that you've gone to in that bit.ly link, the Innovator Island bit.ly link, is publicly available. You can go to that anytime you like. The only modules I'm covering today are 0, the setup, and 1, the deployment. And you can get to that at any point that you need to. This video of this session we're running today will also be sent out to all attendees if you want a guided walk through those modules. But otherwise, you can follow the instructions in the GitHub repo. Okay, so my deployment here is now completed. You'll see successfully created and updated the stack. So what we can do now, we now want to deploy the main part of the application. So I'm going to change directory into the SAM app directory here. Now this one's slightly different. I'm going to run SAM build, and what this does is it runs the package.json file and installs any of the modules needed for the application through various functions that are there. There's only a couple of functions here, so it's pretty fast. And then, just like before, we'll run SAM package. This package is the template YAML file and uploads it to our S3 bucket. And that, again, is pretty fast because it's a small application. And then I'm going to deploy that to my AWS account. And again, this part will just take a couple of minutes because it contains all of the resources used by the application. So you'll see in the instructions here, it contains a number of different Lambda functions, S3 buckets, the DynamoDB table, and other resources that are packaged together. So we'll just wait for that to deploy, and I'll come back to the instructions in just a moment. So one of the questions we have is about credits for doing this workshop. So we're not issuing AWS credits for this workshop, but most of what we're doing here is available within free tiers. So if you run through these steps, for most people who have an account that's less than 12 months old, it should be covered by the allowance that's available there. But even if you incur a cost, it should be fairly minimal. At the end of day 5, I'll show you how to remove resources to minimize the cost of running through the workshop. One of the questions is about Amplify Console. So I'm only showing you the very basic capabilities of Amplify Console, but you can add multiple stages and build your own deployment scripts. And it's a fairly elaborate service. So if you have a large production scale application and you deploy spa-style apps generally, this is a great way to do this because it lets you have multiple stages and lots of different rules configured for your deployments. One of the questions from somebody is about if you have to miss the last workshop, how can you catch up? So on day 5, if you miss that workshop, don't worry. We'll be covering the very last module in the workshop in the GitHub repo. But these videos will be emailed out to all of the attendees on this call, so you can catch up there. Also, I put my contact details on the opening and closing slides. So if you have any questions following this, feel free to contact me anytime you like. Okay, so that now has finished. My deployment is complete, so I'll continue back to the instructions to where I was. So I'm on step 8, configuring environment variables. So I'm going to copy this block of code here, or these commands. Now this looks complicated. It's really not that hard. What it's doing is it's pulling environment variables from the last CloudFormation deployment. They're things like bucket names, so we can use them later on. So I'll just copy this list here and paste that into my Cloud9 instance. And you'll see the 4 echo commands just echo back the bucket names that we'll be using a little bit later. As the instructions show, it looks very similar. So that we have the DynamoDB table that we'll be using to get the list of rides for our application. But currently this table is empty. So the next step is to populate the table. So in step 1, I'm going to cd into this directory. And then I'll run npm install just to install the packages used by the script. Okay. Finally, I'm going to run this script. You'll see in this command here is using 2 of the environment variables that we set up in the earlier step. Let's take a quick look at what that script did. So if I go to that directory, one app deploy and local app, and open import data, this is a very simple Node.js script, and all it's doing is it's uploading the contents of a CSV file into DynamoDB. So down here you'll see there's a line using the document client to batch write that information into the database. And in our table CSV file, this is a CSV file containing a list of the rides and where they should appear on the map. So all we've done in that last command is upload it to our DynamoDB table. Okay, so at that point you'll see the same sort of output I had there, showing that it's uploaded those entries into a table. Let's now test what we've done with that table and the configuration that we've built with the backend. So in step 1, let's do a table scan to make sure that the items are actually in the table. So here, if I paste this command, it returns a list of a blob of JSON with 27 records indicating those are the items that have been added to the table. And then now we can test the endpoint to make sure that's working. So if we copy this final command here, this will use the CloudFormation stack to figure out what the endpoint was called. So I'll just paste that in there. And that is the API gateway endpoint that was deployed. Now if we click on that endpoint and click on open, the browser will call that endpoint and you'll see that all the JSON that it returns. So that's an API gateway endpoint. We can prove that that's actually working with that browser call. So back to the instructions. Now you've got this endpoint that's appeared and you've tested the endpoint. You can see that it's retrieving that list of entries from DynamoDB. What we then need to do is give this endpoint to the front-end application so it can call the endpoint to get the list of rides. So in these instructions, what we're going to do is open the front-end code and look at the source directory to find where the endpoint is added in the config.js file. So we're looking at these. So I'll go back to the Cloud9 instance, and I'll close down this directory and go to the theme park front end, and then open the source directory. And I'll close down this to make it a bit clearer, and there you'll see there's this file called config.js. Now in config.js, each part of this is separated out by modules throughout this workshop. So we only worry about module 1 today, so that's the part that we need. So in this instruction, we want to make sure that we can put the API endpoint into the config just there. So we're going to copy that API and paste it into this file. So just down here, I'll copy this URL to my clipboard and paste that into the init state API value. Now in Cloud9, anytime you have a file that's not been fully saved, you'll see a little circle appearing up there. So make sure that you remember to save the file. So you can go to File, Save, or you can press Control-S. But as soon as you save it, that little circle will disappear. So at this point, what we've done is we've added the API endpoint to the front-end code. But now we need to commit the code back to our repo and let Amplify Console detect that and rebuild the front end for us. So that's pretty straightforward, fortunately. All we have to do is commit the change, and the rest will happen automatically. So I'll cd into this front-end directory. And then we're going to commit this change. It'll only be a one-file change. It's only the config.js file that we've changed. And then we'll say git push. So this pushes the code to code commit. Now what's interesting is in step 3, if we then go back to Amplify Console, what you'll see is that it started a new build, even though we didn't tell it to. And the reason for that is that we've told Amplify Console to watch this GitHub repo, or this code commit repo. So every time we push a change to that repo, it starts a new build process. Now this is very useful in production systems because it does a lot of testing in the build for us. So if there's a problem with the build, the existing version stays running and is available to our customers, while a problematic build will be rolled back. Whereas if the build is okay, it's then staged out correctly, and then users are switched across at the very end once the deployment is successful. So this saves a lot of time instead of doing it manually, where you might be copying files across to S3 buckets. Again, this build process takes a couple of minutes, but once it's available, we'll be able to look at the changes we've made in the live production front end. So I'll wait now just for this build to be complete, and I'll just check to see if you have any questions. So yes, one question about Amplify deployments, about the blue-green approach. So yeah, exactly. Basically, when you deploy new versions in Amplify, it's deploying a separate stack completely. And only when it passes all the various tests will it then point production users across to that new version. So it's a great way to deploy these sorts of applications. One question is about using SAM over serverless frameworks. So these are both frameworks that automate CloudFormation for us and make it easier for us to use CloudFormation for serverless development. Essentially, they both have different pros and cons to using them. Serverless framework has a plugin ecosystem, whereas SAM has deep integration to all of the different AWS services. So it's worth trying both and seeing which one you prefer. But the most important thing is that you choose to use a framework because it's a lot easier than doing things directly through the console. So no more questions about Amplify Console. Yes, you have a lot of capabilities with Amplify Console, such as using custom domains, setting your own environment variables, configuring TLS and SSL certificates automatically, and that kind of thing. So the vanilla out-of-the-box settings choose sensible defaults for us to deploy an application for a workshop like this. But for all of the things you want to do in live production web apps, it actually has a lot of capabilities it can automate to make it a lot easier. It also has a very generous free tier allowance. So if you want to try using this for any of your home projects or just smaller projects, generally speaking, you can do that without incurring any cost. So my build process is still continuing here with Amplify Console. Let me just switch back to the instructions. So we're just waiting at this point in this very final stage of part 1 to deploy this to Amplify Console, and then we'll verify that those changes have happened. Currently, the provision part has happened, and we're currently in the build process. Now here you'll see my build has failed, so what we can do is dig in here and see what has happened. It's asking me to re-authenticate with my build provider, so I'll just do that quickly. What I'm going to do is just make a slight change to this file so we can start another build. I'll just do another deploy to Git. This will force Amplify Console to do another build. So it looks like we're having a few issues with Amplify Console today with a couple of errors, but typically what would happen is that with these kind of changes, we'd simply go through the different check marks and complete the deployment. But it's interesting, when you have a problem like I just had there, the existing application continues to run, so it doesn't take down the existing application. So it is a safe way to do these kinds of deployments. So once that's completed with this, what you'll be able to do is be able to refresh that URL and see the rides appearing on the map. So we'll just see if our build process here will continue. This time the provision happened much more quickly. So the good question from Gina in the Q&A saying, how does Amplify Console know that the new deployment is okay before switching over to it? Well, what you can do in a production system is you can produce your own build script for the Docker container it's using to make sure it passes the build there. But you can also use tests in your view script. So if you have tests run, it will run through the entire gamut of tests. And if any of the tests fail there, it won't continue with the deploy. In this workshop, we're not using that, so the builds generally are pretty straightforward and will generally pass all the tests and be deployed. One of the other useful things you'll notice is it takes screenshots of the application, and it does this with different device types. So it's an easy way to see what your application looks like using different devices. And you can see that in the list of all of these different previews in the menus on the left-hand side. These are all the different build settings that you can apply as well. So this is a vanilla script, but you can apply any type of build script that you need to. Okay, so my deployment is now completed here. So I'm going to open up this URL again. Now what you'll see that's different this time is the first time we just had a map, whereas now we have rides appearing on the map in all their different locations. Now if I open up my console in the browser, and I'll just refresh, you can see that the application called this API gateway endpoint and received this list of rides and then populated the map. So what we've successfully done here is connected the front end to the back end, and this is now our second deployment using Amplify Console. So we're at our hour for today, but I just wanted to give you a quick recap of where we are. So today we set up Cloud9 as our IDE, and we deployed our front-end and back-end applications. Now, I know a few of you had some issues, and if you've not caught up, don't worry. You can continue to do that after this session is finished. Now, at the moment, the front end doesn't do very much other than pull the list of rides from the database. But tomorrow, we're going to start adding more core functionality to make it more useful to park visitors. This will include things like real-time ride updates. So after this workshop today, please don't terminate any of the resources you created in your AWS account, because we'll continue to do everything there tomorrow. Cloud9, when you close the browser, will automatically suspend itself after 30 minutes of being switched off and not being used. So when you come back tomorrow, it will be usable again. So hopefully you enjoyed day one of this theme park workshop. Give us some feedback in the polls that we put out at the end in your console. Let us know what you liked, didn't like, and how we can change this. We'll continue answering questions in the Q&A window for the next few minutes. And alternatively, feel free to reach out to me on email or Twitter. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time today, and I'll see you again tomorrow at the same time, same place. Thanks once again.